Hey everyone, so today is going to be our last lesson on solving quadratic equations. This is using the quadratic formula, so it's a pretty famous formula, and I think it was created by or discovered by Pythagoras, but I'm not 100% sure on that. I'll look that up and I'll let you know. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint slides with you, and then we're going to go over the examples together. All right. Okay, so solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. Your quadratic equation needs to be in standard form, so no vertex form and no factors. So if it is in vertex form or factors, use the methods that is best for those forms. But if your equation is in standard form and it's not obviously factorable, then you're going to use the quadratic equation or the quadratic formula. Note that your quadratic equation needs to have all the terms on the same side and 0 on the other side, as we've been doing most of the time when we're solving quadratic equations. Okay, so let's take a look at some different kinds of equations that we're going to practice with. Here we've got 6 equations. The first 4 are already set equal to 0. Some of them have all 3 terms, the a term, the b term, and the c term, or the squared term, the x term, and the constant term, however you want to think about that. Some of them are missing some terms. So this one is missing the x term, and this one is missing the constant term, or the number. Okay? And then the last 2 are in standard form, but their terms are kind of mixed around, and we don't have it set equal to 0, so we're going to have to fix that. Okay, so the steps for solving a quadratic equation using the formula is clearly, first, make sure the equation is set equal to 0. And then you're going to want to make a note of what the a, the b, and the c are in that standard form. And plug these values into the quadratic formula, because the quadratic formula has the a, the b, and the c. It uses those numbers to solve for x. And then we simplify once we have everything plugged in. Well, what is the quadratic formula? Okay. So I don't know if you got that, but you can rewatch that if you want. We're going to take some notes and go through those examples, and I'll write down the formula on our note paper. So if you haven't already, pause this and get out some note paper, because it does help to learn the information, to learn this algebra if you are actually working along with us. So solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. Okay, so the quadratic formula gives you x. So it starts out x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. And this a, b, and c are what are in your standard form of the equation. So you need to find what those are in each equation and then plug them in. All right, so let's take a look at an example. The first example was x squared minus 10x minus 24 equals 0. Now this one you could factor. I can think of 2 numbers that multiply to give me 24 but add to give me negative 10. But we're not going to do that. We're going to use this formula and see if our answers would be the same. So we say x equals, by the way, here's our a, which is 1. If it's not written in, it's 1. Here's our b, and here's our c. So the formula says x equals the opposite of b. In this problem, b is negative 10. So the opposite of b is positive 10. And then we say plus or minus the square root of b squared. Now b is -10, so I'm going to say -10 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c. C is -24. All divided by 2 times a, and a again is 1. So notice that I've just plugged everything in, even the ones I've plugged in to the formula. And now what I'm going to do is simplify. So I have 10 plus or minus the square root. A -10 squared is 100. And then a -4 times a -24. Now that's going to be positive 16. 4 times 4 is 16. 96. That's going to be 96. All divided by 2 times 1 is 2. 10 plus or minus the square root of 196 divided by 2. Now I know the square root of 196 is 14, so I'm going to say that equals 10 plus or minus 14 divided by 2. And so remember when we were solving using square roots a while ago, we would get sometimes this equation where we had two results. And what we did was we said, well, that's 10 plus 14 divided by 2, and it's also 10 minus 14 divided by 2. You've got the plus answer and the minus answer, and you need to work out what those are. 10 plus 14 is 24 divided by 2. That gives you 12. 10 minus 14 is -4 divided by 2. That gives you -2. Okay, so those are our two answers. All right. And like I said, if you can factor, it would be much easier to factor, right? If I can factor, if I can think of that, two numbers that multiply to give me -24 and add to give me -10. Well, that'd be x minus 12 and x plus 2, right? That multiplies to give me -24, adds to give me -10. And then when I set each one of these equal to 0, I get the answers, 12 and -2. So that's much easier than using the quadratic formula. And you might wonder, well, why am I even using the quadratic formula? It's look at all this math. But some equations cannot be factored. And so this is the only route that you have to solve it. It's the only way. I also want to explain a little bit of this formula. Let me go back a little bit, because some of this might be a little familiar. Especially this part here, this opposite of b over 2a, this little piece of the formula has come up before. That opposite of b over 2a is the x-coordinate of the vertex. So if we have a quadratic equation or a formula, and I mean a parabola, and it looks something like this, or it looks something like this, the x-coordinate of the vertex cuts the parabola in half. Remember, that's also on the line of symmetry. And then you'll have a positive or negative answer, sometimes a positive or negative distance away from that vertex. So that's this plus or minus part. It's giving you a positive distance and a negative distance away from the vertex to get these zeros or these x-intercepts. Okay, so that plus or minus distance is this other piece. You can kind of think of this as two pieces separated by a plus and a minus. Sometimes you'll get two equations or two answers, and sometimes you won't. And let's take a look at what happens when that occurs. So I'm going to turn this over, and we're going to do some other of the examples. All right, the second example, 2. 3x squared minus 75 equals 0. Now this equation would definitely be easier to solve using square roots, but you can use the quadratic formula. Here's my a, here's my c, and in this problem b is 0. So I have x equals the opposite of b, well the opposite of b is still 0, plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 0, so 0 squared minus 4 times a is 3, times c, -75, divided by 2 times a, And that's the quadratic formula. Remember that you can pause this video if you need to catch up. All right, so now we're going to simplify this. We're going to get plus or minus. We still have the plus or minus part because this is going to equal something. 0 squared is 0. A negative times a negative is positive. 75 times 12, basically. 75 times 12 is 900. So that's going to be 900 divided by 6. 900, well, that's 9 times 100, plus or minus. This is where simplifying square roots comes in handy. So 9 times 100, I can think of it like this, right? And then I can take the square root of 9, and I can take the square root of 100. Plus or minus, the square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of 100 is 10. So I've broken out, and I've gotten rid of the square root. So I have plus or minus 30 over 6, which is plus or minus 5. And those are my two answers, plus or minus 5. All right, let's try another example. Number 3. V squared plus 5v equals 0. So in this equation, our a is 1, our b is 5, and this time c is 0. Let's see what happens when that's the case. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared. What's b squared? Well, it would be 5 squared minus 4 times a is 1 times c is 0. And then 2 times a again is 1. So make sure you can see how that's gotten put into the formula. Okay, so then we simplify. See if you guys can pause this video and simplify this expression and see what you get. Okay, so I'm going to work through it. Negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 25, because this part here is going to go to 0. Anything times 0 is 0, divided by 2. And so then I get negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 25 is 5. And that's divided by 2. So now I have these two pieces. I've got negative 5 plus 5 divided by 2, and I've got negative 5 minus 5 divided by 2. Negative 5 plus 5 is 0, so 0 divided by 2 is 0. This is negative 10 over 2, which is negative 5. So these are my two answers, 0 and negative 5. Okay, let's continue. We have a few more. Number 4, 5m squared plus 5m minus 280, big number, equals 0. Okay, see if you can write that down. All right, now this is my A, this is my B, this is my C. So I want you to pause the video and see if you can plug in these values into the quadratic formula. So I have x equals the opposite of b would be negative 5 plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 25. You can go ahead and put that in if you want, or 5 squared, minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2 times a. Now these are some big numbers, and you can put this into the calculator, which is also kind of nice. So let me show you how to put this in the calculator. We can do this whole thing into the calculator, but we have to do it twice. So we have to do it once with the positive and once with the negative. So let me show you here. I'm going to put parentheses around the numerator because this whole thing is going to get divided by that. And I can put parentheses around the denominator as well, just to be clear. So I'm going to say parentheses, negative 5 plus the square root. Now in my calculator, I have to put parentheses because I've got all those things inside the square root, and I want to make sure they all go together. So I'm going to say 25 minus 4 times 5 times a negative 280 Okay, I'm going to close the parentheses. That's the inside parentheses. So this has an inside parentheses. And then I'm going to put another parentheses out here at the end. And then that whole thing divided by, well, I can do parentheses 2 times 5, or I could just put in 10, since I know what that is. Let's see what we get. Oh, I get 7. Wow, all that, and I got 7. Well, I know I'm going to have another negative. I'm going to have another answer, not necessarily negative, but I do have to use this minus here. It looks like it will be negative, because a negative and a negative makes a negative. So let's just see. Same idea, parentheses, negative 5 minus the square root, parentheses, 25 minus 4 times 5 times a negative 280. Close that parentheses that's inside the square root, and then another parentheses that's the whole numerator, and then divided by, I'm just going to put 10 this time, and I get negative 8. So negative 8 and 7 are my two solutions. All right, let's try another one, number 5. On the assignment, you're going to be using the quadratic formula, and I would like to see that you have plugged this in and simplified. All right, let's try this one. That's 7r squared equals 14r plus 21. So this one has to be set equal to 0 first, unlike the rest that came before. So in order to set this equal to 0, I need to subtract 14r and subtract 21. So I have 7r squared minus 14r minus 21 equals 0. Now I can divide by 7. I can see that 7 is a common factor of all those. So let's do that. Let's clean this up. R minus 2r minus 3 equals 0. Now you can factor that as well. But let's go ahead and plug this into the quadratic formula. I'm going to pause. I want you to pause this and see what you can do, how far you can get. See if you can get all the way to the end. Okay, so we're going to say R equals the opposite of B. In this case, it's positive 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared minus 4. A is 1, C is negative 3. Make sure you pay attention to the signs. C is negative 3, so it's got to be here, negative 3. Times 2A, and A is 1. So you have 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared is 4 plus 12. 2. 2 plus or minus the square root of 16 over 2. 2 plus or minus the square root of 16 is 4. And then we have 2 plus 4 over 2, if you want to write it like this, and 2 minus 4 over 2. 2 plus 4 is 6. 6 divided by 2 is 3. 2 minus 4 is negative 2. Negative 2 divided by positive 2 is negative 1. So those are our two answers. Go ahead and circle the answers up here as well. Okay, we have one more example. Let's see what we get when we do this one. This is example 6. 3x squared equals negative 24 plus 22x. I recommend that you pause the video and see what you can do with this one. So the first step is to get everything equal to 0. So I'm going to add 24 and subtract 22x from both sides. Now you may wonder, why am I moving these two when I could just move this one? Well, it doesn't really matter in the quadratic formula. You just need to make sure you're paying attention to what the A, the B, and the C are. However, in the factoring method, we made sure we got everything to the side where the squared term is positive, because it's a lot easier to factor with a positive squared term than a negative squared term. All right, so I have 3x squared. I'm going to rearrange the terms so they're in the right order. All right, so this is what I have. 3 does not go into everything, so I'm just going to leave it like that. I'm not going to try and factor. This might take too long to factor. It might be just as easy to use the quadratic formula. So I say x equals, the opposite of b is positive 22 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, and then 2a at the bottom. All right, let's see what we get here. 22 plus or minus the square root of negative 22 squared. What is negative 22 squared? 22 squared is 484. Negative 22 squared is also 484. Negative times a negative is positive. Minus 12 times 24 is 288. Minus 288 and 6. So this is what we get. 22 plus or minus 484 minus 288 to 196 again. And again, 196 is 14, so 22 plus or minus the square root of 196 is 14 divided by 6. And then at this point, we're going to rewrite it. 22 plus 14 divided by 6 and 22 minus 14 divided by 6. So that's 36 divided by 6, which is 6. 22 minus 14 is 8. So 8 divided by 6. 8 divided by 6. Well, that simplifies to 4/3. I'm just going to leave it 4/3. Okay, so this brings up an interesting point. If you're solving and you just plug this into the quadratic formula, you are going to get sometimes a decimal that's not very nice. And so in that case, don't write down the decimal that's not very nice. Go back through and simplify as much as you can the square root and leave it in the simplified form. Leave it in the exact form. So this would be the exact answer. As we've talked about before, if I were to write this as a decimal, it would not be exact because I'd have to round at some point. Okay, so hopefully that has helped you with the assignment that I'm going to post. If you have any questions, we will go over those on Wednesday and also on Thursday.